All right, welcome folks to episode 1 of the Emotional Communication Podcast. Man, I'm stoked to be here. So in case you're listening on one of the audio platforms and you're not watching us on YouTube, I'm Jeremy Tate. I'm here with Taylor McLaughlin, who's joining me here today.
Yes, sir.
And here's the thing. Even talking with a lot of people, there are a lot of people I know that want to hear more about emotional communication. So we got this set up fast. Like literally one of the lights is not even, it's not even ready. I had to return it to Amazon. The power cord didn't work. Well, like the background decorations aren't all set up. So again, for you guys watching on YouTube, we're getting there. But we had to dive in here because emotional communication is such an important topic. And really what we're going to talk about today is we're going to address me from several years ago where my bachelor's degree is in statistics and I prided myself on
being great with people.
Yeah. No stereotypes there, but they're real indeed. But the thing is, I prided myself on being a very logical thinker. I communicated logically, and some of my biggest frustrations for people in the world were that people didn't act rationally. And it was really frustrating to me because even I went to economics classes, we're talking about supply and demand and how consumers always pick the best option for their choice. Yep. And then I'd be in these scenarios and people didn't behave that way. It was really frustrating. And so it came out of this desire to how do we actually communicate well to people? How do we be effective? That I discovered that we're not all communicating just logically and that everybody's communicating emotionally. So really even this podcast episode is what I wish I had several years ago because it would have saved me a lot of time and effort. Mm-hmm. Banging my head against the wall, thinking that if I just said this and made this little logical argument better, people are gonna change and they're gonna grow and it'll make more sense. I should have been more where you were at, Taylor, like better connecting with people. But so before we get into emotional communication,
what we're gonna talk about though throughout all of this podcast is that's a learned skill because naturally you weren't the best salesperson or communicator on stage. You've had a lot of opportunities to learn to grow in that, as have I. Because if you would have saw me when I was in high school, there's no way that you would have guessed that I'm able to communicate and do what I've done for a living over the last 10 years or so.
Exactly. Well, and that's a great point because one of the biggest myths on that is that some people are just good at communication and some people are just good with emotions and other people just aren't. And that if you have it, you do. If you don't, you don't. But I think one of the best guy's a sales trainer, also by the name of Jeremy. Jeremy Miner, on his podcast, what they'll do is they'll constantly ask people, they'll say, were you born with advanced sales ability? And then one guy will be like, yes. And he's like, just kidding. No. And what we realize is nobody's born with this natural ability to communicate well. It's actually along the way some people pick it up. So let's actually dive into why it's not the case that people don't just communicate logically and why that actually doesn't work. So one of the things I'm putting you on the spot a little bit here, Taylor.
Okay.
But I remember back in the day, long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, there was a time where you even were kind of proficient at acquiring dating relationships. Maybe that's one way to say it. And I remember talking is put another way is you and friends of yours were really, really good at communicating with people in such a way that you actually connected, which is funny because a lot of young men are sometimes struggle and are frustrated in that arena. And I'm assuming it was all completely just logically, you just say the right thing and that
100%. Now that I'm married, all marriage dating communication is logical. That was sarcasm, and we'll talk about that later in the podcast.
Right.
But definitely something learned. Yeah,
absolutely. So with that inside marriage, how do things typically go? Well, again, there's a conflict with your wife.
Yeah.
How do things go when it's just if you try to just communicate logically? What typically happens?
Yeah. Well, I mean, this last weekend we were at a marriage conference at our church, and there's a video, and I've seen it played in lots of contexts about the gal. She has the nail in the head.
Oh, yep.
Right. And so Kendra will have a problem that she's dealing with, and I logically can say ABC, here's the answer. She doesn't want that. What she's actually searching for is to be seen and heard, and that somebody is with her in the midst of whatever that is. And it took me a few or many failures in not fixing her problem, but being like, man, that sucks. And I'm still learning on how I can better communicate with her and just being where she's at. And at the same time, the logical part of me is, okay, how can I be with her there and encourage her to grow through whatever it is on her own? And she knows that I'm there to help should she need it.
Yeah, that's great. So if you were to kind of compare and contrast a little bit, like what you do now in situations like that, and what you say now compared to, a month after you guys were married, like how would you handle that, like a same situation where, again, she's going through something tough, you're trying to be husband of the year, like how do you communicate differently now?
So I learned how to do it very well and as a salesperson, and it was it's a skill, and I'll name what the skill is. It helped me the most in my sales career, and it also has helped me the most in my marriage, and it's a word called listening. When I would shut my mouth and listen to what it is that she had to say, that is where I was really starting to grow in being, okay, here's where she's at, and then what's the emotion behind what she's saying,
right?
Because here's actually what she means,
right,
behind it, because she could say one thing, but she actually means something else because of the emotion that's charging it.
Right. And that's huge. And that's really the core skill of emotional communication is emotional active listening, because so many people get themselves into trouble because they just listen to what someone says. And and it's one step better to listen for what someone means, but oftentimes that's not enough. It's actually where you listen for the emotions behind what someone means. The other thing with listening too is really good listening is not a passive exercise.
Not at all.
Yeah. It's not just you talk and I'll just kind of maybe check my phone real quick, look up. Like that communicates something completely different than when someone's engaged with their body language. Like even one of the common body language signs is when you kind of tilt your head slightly sideways. It's usually what people do when they're kind of curious. Like, somebody says something and they're like, well, tell me more. Like when you do that versus listening, it's communicating even if you're not saying anything.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And so let's break down emotional communication as a whole. People I've talked to have said something like, I've talked about emotional communication. I used to be in this boat too. Is they'll say something like, well, that's great, but I'm more of a logical communicator. Like,
me too.
It's like somebody else communicates emotionally. I communicate logically. Or let's say something like, I'm just not really artistic. I'm like, just a lot of guys I know. One of my friends who's a counselor over in Missoula, he would tell me that he works with a lot of, he called them Montana men, home state of Montana here. He said they'd be telling him something like, they would say I was angry over something. And as a good counselor, he's trying to help them figure out what's really going on. And he knows that anger isn't an emotion that's isolation. There's other things with that. So he'd say, okay, if you're angry, like what else are you feeling? And they'd say, I'm frustrated.
It's the same thing.
Right. And his point was like I know a lot of guys that are in that category that are like, well, if that's emotional communication, I'm a logical guy. Like I'm not that. My wife might be emotional, but not me. Or even I've talked to people who talk about how to communicate emotionally, and they'll say, well, I don't want to manipulate people. Like I don't want to, I'm not trying to hype them up. And all of those are examples of emotional communication, but it's kind of like thinking about one meal, breakfast, and one type of food, eggs, and thinking that's the only thing. And you're like, maybe you don't eat eggs for breakfast.
Or you got to have a pancake.
Right, exactly. Yeah, it doesn't mean you don't eat food. Like those are some specific examples, but emotional communication is way more broad. So here's what's actually going on. We're always communicating emotionally and logically. There's always a logical component of what we're saying, and there's an emotional component. And the people who are really effective at emotional communication aren't just expressing their own emotions. They're actually thinking about the other person's emotions. And so I don't know those. There's a very famous quote by oh man, it's in my notes. I don't remember her name. I think it's Maya Angelou, but she said that people will forget what you did, they'll forget what you said, but they'll never forget how you made them feel.
Yep.
And that quote sums up the importance of emotional communication. It's not actually about just like manipulating or expressing. It's actually about causing people to feel and understand what we're actually saying. Because when we say something, there isn't just the logic of it, but there's kind of how you're saying it, how it's making someone feel. So that is actually what emotional communication is. So if somebody's like, well, I'm just a logical communicator, you are. But there's also an emotional piece to it. Yeah, and just so many examples. Like one of the ones I was thinking about, like workplaces. This came up a lot there's a group I led last fall that we dove into a lot of emotional communication things. And we did this thing. There was a kind of a poll at the start of the group of like what's most important to grow in. Conflict, I think, was the number one thing, and also workplace stuff. So like, how do I tell my boss no without seeming like I'm not a team player? Like, you could say, hey boss, I can't take on this new project. And that you could say it that way, or you could say something like, hey boss, I want to prioritize the projects you've already given me. And I understand it's really important to you to make sure these things get done well. I think if I take on this new project, it's not going to go as well for all these other things. So I don't want to take this on. And that's going to mean something totally different.
Yeah.
And that's specifically using different word choice, a little bit of tone, maybe even body language. And you're communicating something different. Your boss thinks something different about you based on what you said. And it wasn't logically at the end of the day, you said the same thing. I'm not doing 100%. The project.
Yep.
But the emotional part of it is different.
Yeah, I agree. And I was thinking, just in that small example, I would have asked the question. So like, if I'm working on all of these 3 projects over here and you're trying to add this other one, how am I supposed to be proficient in all of them and get them done at 110% excellence? I guess you can work out a game plan, but the reality is he'll realize that, I truly am putting too much on your plate at this point in time.
Absolutely.
But yeah, communicating the same thing is no.
Exactly. Yeah. And here's the crazy part is how your boss responds to those is likely going to be completely different, or at least what they think of you or think of your intentions.
Yep.
Based on actually how you said it.
Yeah.
Even though you said the same thing. And so a couple things you just did there that, and I know you were so excellent and so practiced with these that somebody could maybe even miss. But even when you asked that, you kind of had this almost like confused look on your face a little bit, like you're trying to figure out. And confusion as an emotion is so good at disarming things.
Absolutely.
Same with you framed it in a way that put their interest ahead. Like you use really good word choice. Your body language, you kind of lean your head to the side like you're trying to figure out how to problem solve. All of those things are parts of it. Which brings us to actually the simplest way to remember kind of the components, like brass tacks, getting down to emotional communication, what it actually is. Because here's the thing. This was such a frustration for me. For a long time, people would say things like, "Oh, Jeremy, just be empathic. Like just have empathy."
Have empathy. Yeah.
Yeah. And I was like, that was great.
That easy.
How do you do it? What do you say? What do you supposed? Oh no, just connect with people. Connect. Like, how do you connect? And it turns out, for a while, I thought it was sort of this. Either you have it or you don't. It's this ethereal things. But I started to realize there are very specific behaviors and things you can do that actually communicate empathy or communicate that you're connecting. And so really those fall into three big categories. And just remember those via the acronym, by the way, or BTW, somebody text BTW. Yeah. And it's body language, tone, and word choice. And those are the 3 big categories. Body language, which includes your facial expressions, your tone, which really we're using to incorporate like the pitch, the speed, the volume, all of that inside your voice, the tone, And then the word choice, meaning you could say, hey, boss, not taking the project, or
Not today.
exactly, or kind of how you said it, different words trigger different things. They put a different light on things. And so those three things, what we're going to do is hit those three pillars over and over and over again and talk about how do we actually align those things with the message that we want to communicate. And how do we do that? So before we even get down that road, because we got a lot of podcast episodes to make and that, a lot of things to share. Like some of the biggest requests have been like, how do you say no? Like how do you say no in certain situations? How do you handle conflict? How do you connect with people in conversations? Small talk was a big one. I know a lot of people
feel so awkward in small talk.
Feel super awkward. They're like, I love a deep conversation, but I hate small talk at a party. Like a lot of exactly how to have good conversations. All of that stuff is coming. But even before that, maybe Taylor, could you share an example of maybe how you've used either like body language, tone, or word choice to maybe like communicate well emotionally, or maybe even how you use sarcasm and things like that, just to give an example before we get into all those other things that are coming.
Yeah, I mean, when you were talking about the tonality of confusion, it took quite a while for me to learn how I can act confused, and not act in a negative or manipulative way, but there's a situation in front of me and I know that I want a certain result, and I know that I also don't want to frustrate I don't want to be building walls. I want to be building bridges with people.
Right.
So I can leverage different tonalities, whether I'm flustered or I'm really excited, to encourage them to maybe think in a different way and see more in light of it. And the easiest example was kind of at the earlier part of the podcast. You had mentioned the dating thing. Like I learned that I used to be shy, and that I was really shy through most of high school and everything. And then when I got out of high school, and then I started to become a lot more extroverted, and not only with opportunities to get a girl's phone number or go on a date, but with meeting people and friends. I learned that if I could increase my enthusiasm and be enthusiastic and smile and all of that, smiling and eye contact were probably some of the biggest ones.
Yeah.
Because naturally when I'm smiling, now I have a more positive tonality. And it's so much easier to meet someone and make a friend when you're sharing those emotions with them.
Yeah.
And that's not even necessarily in what you're saying.
Right.
That's only my facial expressions through smiling and my tonality and maybe increased volume a little bit and a bit of a faster pace.
Right.
So on the more negative side, it would be like if somebody told me something that's really hard, I would probably look down a little bit, and I'm going to slow down my tonality and probably put a hand on their shoulder. Yeah. And what that does is it goes and it shows it's like, hey, I'm with you. I don't, and those are just two easy examples of if something's hard and you have that appropriate physical touch, the slower, more quiet pace.
Right.
It's so much more easy for them to be like, okay, the world isn't imploding. We can be patient, take this one step at a time. Versus if I'm really excited about something and the sports team scored a touchdown or hit a home run, we're all stoked and we're yelling and cheering. And that's a completely different emotion, but we're trying to convey a different message in that point.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. If you go up to someone and you're like, oh, I'm really glad to see you. Like,
it's like, no, you're not.
No, you're not. Yeah. I'm really glad to see you. And, or same with and it's funny, as I was just earlier today editing one of the Instagram reels, talking about what you say when people are having a really, like, they share something really hard with you. Mm-hmm. And that's one of the things, a lot of people get awkward in that situation where someone's like, hey, you just found out, my mom has cancer, and you're like, oh, like, and a lot of times people, out of their awkwardness and out of trying to care for someone, will say something that really doesn't care for them.
Not at all.
Yeah. And what I started to realize is,
like, my grandma died too.
Right.
Like,
yeah.
That's not what they need to hear.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. There was, to give you a perfect example, some people I know, there's a scenario where somebody's spouse is cheating on them. And they were talking with their friend, and they're like, oh, yeah. I know what that's like. My friend's spouse isn't always the greatest to them either. Like forgot their chocolates on Valentine's Day, kind of.
Yeah.
And they were like, oh, sorry, I get it. And you're like, no,
Not
you
even
don't
close.
Yeah, and it was,
Yeah.
and I think for them, they were really trying to share.
Yep.
But what they didn't actually communicate that, and people aren't going to remember the intentions. They're actually going to remember what actually comes across. And that's what we started to realize is that a lot of the main skills of emotional communication are the same across the board. So you'll have these people that are kind of almost like dating coach gurus, and that they'll have like kind of these like certain kind of like tricks or things that they'll use, and some of them those kind of go. But what you'll discover is that people in the arena of dating know how to connect with people emotionally, and that ability to connect with someone emotionally is also how you have a good small talk conversation.
Absolutely.
Exact same skills, same questions. It's a lot of times how you diffuse a conflict situation. Similar skills and questions. It's the same kind of things when you're like, let's say somebody's trying to take a step, but they're not there, and you're trying to help and convince them to take like a really good step in life.
Yep.
Same skills is, and what I started to realize is it's not like just one domain. If you really learn some of those things, it helps communicate what you actually want to, so that when someone's going through something hard, you can actually communicate, hey, I'm with you. I'm here to support you. When someone's having a good day, you actually communicate that. And the other benefit that I've noticed is once you understand like some of the mechanics, if you're having an off day and you're not feeling like you're not feeling your best, you're not feeling like connecting with someone, you can actually choose to do the things that they need to hear. And even though you didn't feel like it, they still feel like you care. And that was powerful, where I was like, oh, I'm not limited in the fact that I have to have a good day to help someone else have a good day. It's one of those things that can actually be a practiced, trained, learned skill.
For sure.
Yeah, and so that's actually ultimately that's what I'm really kind of excited about in this. And so what we're gonna do is we're gonna dive into next week. This is obviously like quick intro, getting into just the importance of this. But what we're gonna dive into is some of the science behind what's actually happening, like just kind of brain wise, and how actually our brains are wired. We pick up emotions way faster. So, for instance, you're talking about that eye contact and smiling, like so big. There are actually what scientists call mirror neurons in our brain that they're really good at detecting what other people are kind of showing on their faces. And then they try to get us to do the exact same thing. So you notice, like, you smile at someone,
really and they're going to smile.
Yeah, it's really hard to frown back.
My wife hates when she'll be like talking about how she's having a bad day, and I'll be like, man, have you tried smiling? And I say it in a bit of a sarcastic tone, and she'll know that I'm trying to cheer her up a little bit.
Yeah.
Because you physically can't smile and be frustrated at the same time. Just like you can't be mad and laughing at the same time. Completely different emotions in the brain. So if you're having a bad day and you want to have and practice some gratitude, if you can smile, you're going to feel better. And she really gets frustrated when I do that. And I think it's funny and whatever, but that's just a small example of the brain affecting your face and your emotions at the same time.
Exactly. Precisely. Yeah. And the crazy thing is they did a study that confirmed exactly what you're saying, where they did the silliest thing in a classroom. What they did is they had students hold a pencil, kind of, and I'm hoping these are sanitary and clean. Mm-hmm. I think they were, but they held them in their mouth sideways. So it kind of like, imagine you got like a piece, like pencil in your mouth sideways, and it's kind of forcing you into a smile. Then they had another one, they had it hold them a different way, where they're kind of like puckered their mouth around it. So they were kind of in a frown face. Yeah. And then what they did is they just had people read the exact same comics, and they just measured how many times they laughed. And they asked them like to rate at the end how funny they thought they were. And even though they're literally using a pencil to force people to smile or not, they found that the group, guess which group thought the comics were funnier and laughed more?
The one smiling.
The one smiling. And even when it was forced. So the crazy thing is, what that means is you can actually choose to do certain things, and you'll find this. Amy Cuddy did a really popular TED Talk on power posing, which is the same thing. And she showed that there were decreases in cortisol. And I think it was, I have to reference this. I think it might have been an increase in, it was either like dopamine or one of the really really good hormones. After people for like 2 minutes just stood in like a really big like arms out, legs out, like big stance, and it caused them chemically to feel better when they did those things. And so what I'm excited is we're going to get into how do you not just affect your own emotions, but how do you help other people in the same way, and how do you help them experience the same things? And a lot of it's going to come through questions, but the right questions, the right body language with the questions, maybe even the right pausing, things like that. And that's what we're going to dive into.
Absolutely. I'm excited.
It's perfect. It's great. Okay, so it looks like our camera's trying to overheat. So that's probably saying that we should close this one down. So thank you guys for joining this episode. And what we're going to do is dive into next time is what's really some of the science on a high level behind emotional communication and why this works so effectively and what to do and how that works. So thanks for joining us. We'll be back next week.